rainy evening. And let's see, we'll get started here. And Mary Ann, would you lead us?
Heavenly Father and God, we just thank you for this day, and we thank you for every blessing, God. We are so blessed. We thank you for this church and for every person in it. We pray, God, there's not any of us that aren't having health issues or something going in our lives, God, but we know that you're in control, and we just turn it all over to you. We pray for those that are sick, those that couldn't be here this morning or tonight, God. Pray for those that didn't want to be here. Just pray that you would continue to put your arms around this church and every person in it, God. Bless each household and each family in it. And we just ask that you bless John tonight, God, that as he takes his time to teach us, go with us throughout this week. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Glad you're here. We'll pick up here where we left off. I had mentioned that we looked at the photographs when they first took a photograph of the shroud in 1898. Discovered it was a negative, what was on the shroud, and so on. And so the intensive scientific investigation commenced. I was looking at some things today. I was going through this and updating it a little bit, and I was wondering how many books have been written on the Shroud of Turin, or Turin, and it's got to be way into the hundreds. And if you include all the scientific papers that have been written on it, it is in the thousands. And people, as they continue to research it and explain, but they keep discovering more and more. We're going to look at that. Well, one of the things that they discovered in '76 was the three-dimensional image. And original investigators of the stirrup thing when they had it 2 years later, and he took a photograph. Obviously he didn't have the original thing. He took a photograph of the shroud and looked at it under what was called a VP8 image analyzer. He worked at the scientific laboratories there in Albuquerque, and what they did with that was they used that device. NASA used it when they looked at the moon, for instance, and they tried to determine the height of the depth of craters and the height of mountains and hills and so forth. And he, for some reason, just decided he'd put that photograph under there and take a look at it. And when he did, it was dimensionally encoded. It was three-dimensional, had three-dimensional information. Now, the shroud itself, or the photographs, are not three-dimensional, of course. They're two-dimensional, but it has the encoded information from which they can determine the three-dimensional characteristics of it. That's absolutely remarkable, to say the least. And as I said, that's not true of any other photograph. You can't take a photograph, even with modern photography equipment, and determine that information. And so yet another amazing thing, and of course he shared that with people who were interested in studying the shroud. And as you see there, he wrote this book about some of his findings on the shroud. And that may not be real clear, but that shows you how that the three-dimensional characteristics look when they examined it under this technology. And you can see there, and well, I'll get to that in a second, but the way they determined that is by the shades of the image and so forth. And that one on the right gives you a little better idea of how it looks straight on. It's because of the pixelization effect. So the closer to the body the shroud was, the darker the image. And the farther away from the body, the lighter the image. And from that, they could determine the three-dimensional nature of it. And they could use that and do a side view of the face because when they enhance that. And by the way, some people believe, I think I mentioned it, some people believe that they have identified the coins on the eyelids. Once they looked at it there, it looks to me like that's a coin on that left eye. And they not only think they see coins there, but the type of coins that one of them is. So I mentioned the stirrup. It stood for Shroud of Turin Research Project that got underway in '78. And because of all of these things that they'd learned from the photography, from the various analysts, medical experts, and, coroners, all those experts, they decided, the Catholic Church, which owns the shroud and controls it, decided to allow this group of world-renowned scientists to do some testing of it. And they negotiated for quite a while the circumstances. Of course, the church was afraid that they would damage it in some way. They were also afraid they might debunk it, prove that it wasn't real, even because the popes have never come out and declared that the shroud is the burial shroud of Jesus. What they say is it's an extremely important and valuable artifact of the church, the Catholic Church. So they finally agreed to allow, they picked all of these scientists from different disciplines, different expertise, and they set up a time and a way of doing it. And what you see there's a photograph of some of the well-known scientists at that time, and they've allowed them to look directly at the shroud. That fellow with a glove on is holding it in his hand. And there were 24 of them, total of scientists. There was a total of 40 team members from multiple fields of study, and they gave them 5 days of hands-on analysis. They allowed them to have access to the shroud for 122 hours around the clock. That's what they agreed on. And there's another photograph of them. They allowed them to have, as it says, hands-on. They were able to touch it and do tests on it and all kinds of things. And the testing protocol was hands-on, 5 days around the clock, 122 hours. They could not do any destructive tests, obviously. And it took 3 years to analyze what they learned. And they published, the stirrup team published what they learned in 1981. Now, this man you see here is a man named Barry Schwartz. And he's standing next to an enlarged photograph of the shroud, the face of the man on the shroud. Barry Schwartz was a part of that original team. He was a world-renowned photographer. He was a very liberal guy. He's Jewish. He's very liberal. I kind of described him as a hippie at the time. When he was contacted and invited to be a part of that team, he scoffed at it. I'm not interested in that. I ain't interested in you Christian relics, he said. And they said, well, we need you to, and hey, it'd be a free trip to Italy, and we can have some parties while we're there. And by the way, the guy in the shroud's Jewish. And so he agreed to go, and he went and said, we're just going to debunk it in a matter of minutes, hours or minutes, and then we're just going to go out and party and drink. And he said, I have no idea. And now he is one of the leading advocates of the shroud being that of Jesus. So these are some of the tests they performed. Some of them may make sense, some not. Photomicroscopy, if I can say that right. Particle analysis, blood analysis, microchemical analysis. There's one of the priests that's making sure they're doing the things they're supposed to do. They watched them very closely. Optical, infrared, reflective, I can't say it all. Scanning photography from infrared to ultraviolet, infrared, thermograph imaging, low energy X-ray radiography, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy. I can't say all of those words. Just on and on and on. Now, as a result of that testing, many people who scoffed at it were even atheists and wanted to debunk it, had dramatic change of opinion after what they learned. And this man, Tom DeMuha, said we all thought we'd find it a forgery and would be packing our bags in a half hour. And he stayed for the 122 hours and has never been the same since, he says. Dr. John Heller, who was a blood chemist, said, I was convinced it was a forgery, but now there's no question in my mind that there was a scourged, crucified man in the shroud. And that's his book. Almost all of them write books in the area of expertise. Shroud of Turin report on. because he did all kinds of testing and has down through the years. He died recently. Most of these men now are gone. And here's Barry Schwartz again. He said, we can't figure out how this image came to be, but the person we see here fits only one person known to history. This is a Jewish man. This is a secular Jewish man. And he's the one, by the way, that I told you that carried his mother, his very devout Jewish mother, to one of his lectures on the shroud. And they were riding home, and he said, you know, he didn't know how his mama had taken that. So she's sitting there looking straight ahead as they drove home, and he said, well, Mama, what do you think? And she said, of course it's real, Barry, or they would have kept it all these years. He convinced his Orthodox Jewish mother. So, moving from that to looking at some of the more details of it, the textile analysis. I mentioned before, it's a 3-to-1 herringbone pattern twill, which was very common in the first century, especially with linen. It was expensive and rare. You know that the Bible tells us that Joseph of Arimathea, who was a very rich man, part of the Sanhedrin, bought the shroud and took the body of Jesus and placed it in the shroud. It would have been extremely costly, that shroud would have been at the time, because it was of the highest quality. And historians believe that Joseph of Arimathea probably bought that shroud at the temple, because you remember they had all the people there selling stuff, and Jesus ran some of them off, took a whip to them. It adds strength and durability. Threads are hand spun. The image is superficial and penetrates only the top 2 microfibers. About 200 microfibers in a thread. So if you think about the size of a thread, and that is greatly enlarged, of course, and you take just the top 2 fibers, they're much smaller than human hairs, far smaller. 1% of a single thread is the most any of us got on it, and it's inside the cloth facing the body. There's nothing on the other side. It's all, the front and the back is where the body had contact with the linen shroud on the inside. And as a matter of fact, this is what that shows. The one on the left is a photograph of the shroud, somewhat enhanced. And you can see clearly the image of the man, the blood on his arms and around his head and so forth, and his feet. Well, they hung it up and backlit it. And what they discovered on the right, when they shine light through it, strong, powerful light through it, the blood stains are very clear, as you can see, because they're blood. But the image disappears. And they can't explain that. So this is some of the scientific description of it. And one of the things they theorized that could have caused the image was this Maillard reaction, because of what's in the fibers, the linen fibers that are made from flax. And they washed it in soapweed detergent during the original preparation of flax. And they thought it might have, whatever it was, might have reacted with that. A thin carbohydrate layer resides on the surface of all the fibers that occurred naturally as the cloth dried, and something interacted with the carbohydrate fiber to bring about discoloration of the cloth. But they have no explanation. They can't replicate it. They've tried everywhere in the world. The men have been trying for decades to do that, especially people who want to debunk it. There's no variation in the color of the image on the shroud. That's what this is talking about. It's a monochrome half-tone image, and there's no variation in the color. So the image is all the same color. The only difference is that some of it's lighter and some of it's darker, depending on how far away it was from the body. It appears darker due to greater concentration of affected fibers, not because of more substance or a darker substance. Where it appears darker, more fibers affected. Where lighter, fewer affected, somewhat like pixels in a photograph. And then we get to a little bit on the blood chemistry, which we'll talk a good bit about. Here's Dr. Alan Adler, who died in 2000. who was a blood chemist. He said the blood marks seen on the shroud are consistent with a contact transfer to the cloth of blood clot exudates that would have resulted from major wounds inflicted on a man who died upright as a result of crucifixion. And all blood stains demonstrate evidence of gravity flowing downward. So what they're saying is that almost all the blood that they can see on the image in the shroud is flowing downward because he's upright and he's hanging on the cross. They've recently done a lot of research on how the blood would have transferred from the body to the shroud. Now some of the blood, he's lying on his back on the shroud, it's going to drain out. After a person dies, blood no longer flows, it begins to leak, so to speak, to drip or to gradually drain out by gravitational force. But as far as the blood stains that shows on the shroud that would have been there prior to his death, like on his arms and on his head where the crown of thorns was, they had a real difficult time replicating that because the blood clots dry. The blood dries. It don't take long usually, especially in a hot climate. But they were able to determine that it would have happened because as the shroud made contact with the blood stains, there would have been enough moisture left that over time, and it may have created additional moisture as the body lay in it, enough to transfer the blood stains to the shroud. It gets really technical, but that's sort of what they're talking about. So the first thing they determined that the blood was real blood. Well, you remember Barbet, the French doctor, said when he saw it in 1933, he knew when he saw it, it was real blood. But everybody, even now, people claim, no, it's some other substance, it's not real, it's a forgery. So they did immunological, fluorescence, and spectrographic tests. They determined the type of the blood, ABO, and the RH of the blood antigens. Up until DNA, the analysis we have now with DNA, that's the only way we could get blood evidence and try to match it was through the typing of the blood, which is not conclusive, like DNA is. The forensic signature of clotting with red corpuscles about the edge of the clot and a clear yellowish halo of serum are visible. Anytime that blood, especially a significant amount of blood, is lost and winds up on an object, particularly cloth, as it soaks in and begins to dry out, you've seen it many times, the serum will begin to separate. And it's either yellowish, light yellowish, or it's clear. And that's why John said he saw blood and water coming forth. The blood stains test positive for 13 different blood components, including bile, bilirubin, serum albumin, hemoglobin, and others. It's human blood type AB, and they did DNA testing on it and determined it was of human origin. They did not go any further because there was no real reason to. In the future, as that science continues to advance, who knows what the blood will be able to tell us through DNA. By the way, those stains that are pictured there were his feet, where blood continued to drain out of his feet onto the shroud. And going back to bilirubin, people who saw the shroud down through the years, especially people with medical and scientific knowledge, said that it made no sense that the blood was so bright red on the shroud after years. Because if you've ever seen blood, it turns real dark, and then not too long a time, it turns black. And but the blood on this shroud is bright red. And so they said, well, it can't be blood, it can't be human blood, it can't be real because it's too bright. It hadn't turned brown or dark black over time. Well, researchers know that if a person undergoes extreme trauma, duress, torture, facing death, that the bilirubin builds up in the bloodstream. And the bilirubin keeps it red. So the fact that the blood is so bright red still on the shroud indicates how much he was suffering again. He was undergoing torture, incredible pain, incredible agony. And the bilirubin was building up in his blood. And after 2,000 years, I'm convinced, it's still bright red on the shroud. So every time that the naysayers, the people who are not willing to accept that this could be the shroud of Jesus, come up with some claim, the scientific testing refutes it. And here's another very important thing about that, and I think it's how God works in his infinite and perfect wisdom. The people who have made the greatest discoveries about the shroud being linked to Jesus are atheists. They're trying to prove that it's not. They're determined, whatever it takes. We don't believe in such a thing. There's no such a thing as Jesus Christ. There's no as God. There's no such thing as God. We're going to prove it. They wind up proving the opposite. You see, if God chose only men and women who were faithful to him, people could then say, well, you're biased in your research and your discoveries. So God uses his enemies to establish this. He does that in archaeology. He does that in everything. And therefore, you can't claim bias. They're biased the other way. And so after a while, they have to say, it's got to be, I don't know, it's real. Some more characteristics of the image. It's superficial. As I said, only the top 2 microfibers. There's no directionality, such as brush strokes. This is people who still claim today it's a painting, it's a medieval forgery, elaborate forgery. There's no outline to the image. What that means is that artists, before they would paint whatever, they would take charcoal or whatever, and they would draw the outline of what they're going to paint. And where they're going to paint it, make sure they got everything right before they began painting. There's no such thing in that. There's no cementing of fibers as with paint. They long ago determined it wasn't paint. There's uniform intensity, which a human artist cannot do. No variations in the density as with known artworks. No particles between the threads. There's no capillary action except for the blood. There's no paint binder present. They have examined that exhaustively, trying to prove that it's paint or it's dye or it's something elaborate, and they keep proving it's not. It's a negative image with distance info encoded, which means that you can determine the length of his nose, the width of his nose, how deep his eye sockets are, all of those things. The blood is from actual wounds, and the image shows the wounds. AB positive blood and human DNA. There's no image under the blood, which means that the blood was transferred to the cloth before the image. That's important. That's really important. The blood was on there 24 to 48 hours before the image was on it. So that tells us that the image was placed there long after this body was wrapped in the shroud and placed in the tomb. And then that gets us up to the carbon dating, 1988, and this was a huge problem. But what happened was, here again, when they did the carbon-14 dating, they said, you see them there, you see the date. Look at this character right here. Look at him. He's proud of himself, ain't he? All of these men who did this are atheists. And look how proud this guy is. He's written it on the board up there, and he's crossed his arms, and he's saying, we got you. We proved it wrong. Well, so they said it was from 1260 to 1390, based on the carbon-14 dating. But people who had done a lot of study of the shroud and were convinced it was the burial shroud of Jesus said, your carbon-14 dating didn't get the job done. You didn't know what you were doing, or you deliberately misused it. So as they began to look at the carbon-14 dating and the procedure, they determined that the protocol agreed to in 1985 was ignored by the men who did it. They didn't follow that protocol if they'd agreed to. And what they did was they took 3 samples that were supposed to be cut from several different locations, and they took all 3 of them in one little spot. Now these are men who are supposed to be experts on carbon-14 dating, and they made bigger mistakes than somebody who didn't know much about it would do. So it's hard to believe it was accidental. It was probably intentional. The microchemical tests were supposed to confirm the authenticity of the samples. One sample from a seam on the side where it was held during multiple exhibitions. Now, the shroud all down through the years was shown on certain sacred events and certain days. They would take it out and they'd unfold it and they'd hold it, show it to people, hang it up. It was clearly a flawed undertaking, and I put him over there again because he's a smug-looking rascal, ain't he? I think he's dead and gone now. But he decided he had debunked. He was smarter than anybody in the world. He had debunked the Shroud of Turin, and he was proven to be either really incompetent or a fraudster. So that demonstrates how they would demonstrate it or hold it back in the medieval times. And so they'd get it out there and they would hold it, so they would have all their DNA on it from the Middle Ages. And another interesting thing about that photograph, or that drawing I should say, is look how bold they got the image. This was probably back 400-500 years ago. And look how bold the artist did that. And I think that indicates that the image was originally much, much clearer, much bolder, and over time it's gradually faded over the 2,000 years. And I think that's what so stunned Peter and John when they went to the tomb. So, I'll read this quickly here. 1988, radiocarbon laboratories at Arizona, Cambridge, and Zurich determined the age of a sample from the shroud. They reported that the date of the cloth's production was between 1260 and 390 with 95% confidence. This came as a surprise in view of the technology used to produce the cloth, its chemical composition, and the lack of vanillum in its lignin. The results prompted questions about the validity of the sample, preliminary estimates of the kinetics, constants for the loss of vanillin from lignin indicate a much older age of the cloth than the radiocarbon analysis. The analysis sampling area is uniquely coated with a yellow-brown plant gum containing dye lakes. And so the testing results from the sample area coupled with microscopic and microchemical observations prove that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. And here's the big one. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the true age of the shroud. And that's Ray Rogers, a world-renowned thermal chemist who died, I think, in 2016. I got a picture of him here. There it is, 2005. He was one of the first to debunk the carbon-14 dating in 1988. Man was brilliant. He did some amazing things in research and inventions in his field, and he said, that's crazy. There's no way that the shroud that they're looking at was produced 500 years ago. So he outlined the mistakes that debunked the years given by the dating. Carbon twisted in with the flax, cotton I should say. They would make repairs, as I said. Madder root dye on the surface of the threads, a clear splice where the threads were connected, presence of starch to stiffen threads for repair. This is all the work they were doing on it through the centuries. And so the central question becomes, is the Shroud of Turin simply a pious fraud, some kind of religious artwork, or is it the most important archaeological artifact in the world, hidden in plain sight, hidden by controversy and confusion instead of dirt and debris? And that's the picture there is of an alchemist in medieval times that is probably trying to make gold out of cheap metal. That's what they did. I once said, I was teaching at Crime Lab some years ago, and the people I had in the class were, and I was teaching on diversity, and the people I had in the class were scientists and people down at the crime lab. They didn't like me much anyway. And so I told them one time I would ask them a series of questions, and I said, if you'll answer these questions truthfully, I can tell you who you voted for in the last election. One of them was Second Amendment, that kind of thing. And one of them was about evolution. And I told them, I made a statement for all them scientists one day. I said, the theory of evolution, Darwinist evolution, is going to wind up in the dustbin of history with alchemy. And one of them scientists stood up in the back of the room and he said, if you'll meet me outside, I'll whoop your you know what. That's how upset it made him. I said, you've just proved my point here. It was a religion for him. But that's what made me think of that, the alchemist. And so they're trying to say that it was these kind of people who created the shroud, those who don't believe it. And I'll conclude here with this. The scientific versus the legal approach. The prosecutor must show through circumstances that their theory of what took place is the only logical deduction, that the circumstances can be explained by no other theory. That's what prosecutors have to do in a criminal case. Because the defense is going to say, well, what about this possibility and this possibility and this possibility? That's what they do. The defense must show that the same circumstances could be explained by an alternative theory, one that is plausible and fits the facts. So now in the case of the shroud here, those of us who believe in it are the prosecutors. There's only one theory that can explain it and no other. And these folks who are opposed to it, they keep trying to come up with all kinds of explanations for other ways that it came to exist. So weighing the evidence, the burden of proof for a criminal trial is beyond a reasonable doubt. For a civil trial, it's a preponderance of the evidence, or 51%. And I don't have any doubt in my own mind, and hadn't for a long time, that that has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt that it's the burial shroud of Jesus. You may or may not agree, but we all can draw our own conclusions. By the way, an awful lot of religious organizations, Christian organizations, hate this. Answers in Genesis. Now, those folks up there in Kentucky, man, they hate this. They say that anybody who believes that this is the burial shroud of Jesus, believes in all kinds of demon ideals. I've read up on their position on it. And they said the Bible does not allow for such foolishness. So, everybody's got an opinion, is what I'm saying. And so, I'm going to end it with this one, what the Shroud of Turin has meant through the ages. And there's a painting from 1625 by Giovanni Battista della Rovere. And he studied it carefully, didn't he, way back then? Because he shows how they folded the body up in the shroud on the bottom, and then he shows what it looked like on the top. Once again, look how much brighter that image is. And I think that tells us that it has faded over the years. But it's still there to be seen and to be studied. Any thought or comment on that? Question? Let's see where we're going next week, good Lord willing. Oh yeah, we're going back and trace it, because after the carbon-14 dating, and most people just wrote it off. The carbon-14 says it's only 500 years old, and it's a fraud. But there were lots of other people, thankfully, and again, I believe God used that. I believe He used that. If the carbon-14 dating had said it goes back to the 1st century, then a lot of this stuff would not have been examined. And so once they said it only goes back to the Middle Ages, people began to investigate. They began to research and study. And they were able to trace it all the way back to King Abgar. King Abgar lived when Jesus lived. He was the king of Edessa, as you see. And according to Eastern Orthodox Christian religion, he sent a letter to Jesus. He had leprosy, and he sent a letter to Jesus and asked him to come and heal him. And it was delivered to him, and Jesus sent a message back to him and said that he could not, or he would not, that he had other things he had to do. And it's believed that after Jesus' death, that they had to do something with the shroud, because, and we'll get into that, because the Jews would have wanted to destroy it for a host of reasons, because for one thing, they didn't believe in icons, and that it was delivered to King Abgar in Edessa by one of Jesus' disciples, Thaddeus. And that when he received it, and that's a painting, an icon of that when he received it, he was healed of his leprosy and became a Christian. Now, whether that's true or not, we don't know, but I don't see why not. I don't see why not. And then they began to trace it all the way back there and then onward. And hopefully next week we'll get into that. No question? Comment? I hope this is not too boring going through some of this detailed stuff, but it's important to, in the work that's been done, to establish the authenticity of it against all the attacks saying that it's not. And we'll look at King Abgar, and we'll look at some of the Crusaders. Fascinating history, and how it wound up in France and then Italy hundreds of years ago. And one last thing, by the way, the pollen, we'll get to the pollen spores. The pollen spores put it in every one of those places based on the plants that grow there. All the way from Jerusalem to where it is today, through all of France and Constantinople and Edessa, I keep saying Edessa. The pollen spores put it there. All right, thank y'all for coming. Katie Ann, would you lead us?
Father, thank you for this day. Thank you for all the people who showed up, Lord. I pray we have a great week. Bless those who are sick, Lord. And be the ones who are lost and come to know you before it's too late. I pray. Amen.
Amen.